As 1943 drew to a close, Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific campaign was gaining momentum. After seizing the Gilbert Islands in November, the next target became the Marshalls, a vital stepping stone on the long path toward Japan. The plan, called Operation Flintlock, directed Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's amphibious fleet to bypass the heavily fortified outer islands and strike directly at Kwajalein Atoll in the center. Major General Holland Smith of the Marines, commanding V Amphibious Corps, chose the Army's veteran 7th Infantry Division to capture the southern sector, while Major General Harry Schmidt's untested 4th Marine Division, fresh from California, was tasked with seizing the islands of Roi and Namur to the north, where a Japanese airfield lay. Roi itself measured just over 1,200 by 1,250 yards, with Namur connected by a narrow causeway and covered in dense growth that concealed barracks and installations. Defenses included nearly 2,000 men from Vice Admiral Mitsuyuki Yamada's 24th Air Flotilla, supported by 1,200 service troops and 345 men of the 61st Guard Force. They had 35 planes, heavy machine guns, anti-aircraft guns, pillboxes, blockhouses, and trench networks ready for an amphibious assault. By late January 1944, after 2 months of heavy air raids, Vice Admiral Richard Connolly's Task Force 53 arrived and unleashed 3 days of devastating bombardment, dropping more than 2,600 tons of shells and bombs. Lessons learned at Tarawa, where inadequate shelling had caused heavy marine losses, prompted a determination to obliterate every Japanese position on Roi and Namur before the landings. On January 31st, Marine units captured 5 small nearby islets with little resistance, allowing artillery to be positioned for the main attack the next morning. Throughout the night, naval gunfire raked the islands without pause. At dawn, the bombardment briefly stopped as slow LSTs carrying Marines entered the lagoon, then resumed with ferocity. Colonel Louis Jones's 23rd Marines prepared to hit Roi, with 1 battalion landing on Red Beach 2 and another on Red Beach 3, while Colonel Franklin Hart's 24th Marines targeted Namur with simultaneous landings on 2 green beaches. Tanks, engineers, and infantry teams were all loaded into amphibious tractors, each carrying nearly 24 men. The assault was set for 10 a.m., but logistical breakdowns delayed the schedule. Many amphibious tractors ran out of fuel, sank, or were lost overnight, leaving only 62 of 110 vehicles ready. Some units had to swap landing assignments at the last moment, while others were left stranded without transport. Confusion reigned as the attack time was pushed back to 11:00. Meanwhile, Navy warships hammered the beaches with relentless fire, and Japanese command, including Admiral Yamada, was annihilated in their bunkers. At last, the signal flag dropped, and the invasion force surged forward. Gunboats unleashed rockets and cannon fire before turning aside, and the armored amphibians of the first wave roared onto Roi's shore under cover of smoke and flame. They quickly ran into an anti-tank trench just yards from the beach and halted, firing steadily as Marines pushed in behind them. Within minutes, units scrambled across the ditch and began advancing inland, encountering only scattered resistance, as most defenses lay in ruins. Sherman tanks soon arrived to crush isolated strongpoints, and by early afternoon, Marine companies had secured the airfield's edge with surprisingly few casualties. On the left flank, Captain James Scales's men reached Wendy Point expecting fierce opposition, only to find shattered fortifications reduced to rubble by naval fire. Farther inland, riflemen used grenades and explosives to clear out surviving snipers in bunkers and trenches. By 1 p.m., Colonel Jones had set up his command post ashore and radioed that progress was swift and easy, though higher command urged caution before moving further. Impatient tank commanders, unwilling to sit idle on exposed ground, pressed, their vehicles forward, smashing through wreckage and scattering the last defenders as the battle for Roi surged deeper inland. The armored columns clattered across the open field while Marine riflemen moved forward on foot to shield their flanks. A line of amphibious tanks hugged the western shoreline, spraying fire as they advanced. By early afternoon, several Sherman tanks had already taken positions around the northeastern end of the runway, raking the defenses at a site known as Nat Circle. Others pushed up along the northern edge of the strip, sweeping it clean of resistance. For many Marines on the ground, it looked as though the battle would be over quickly, but General Schmidt, overseeing the operation from offshore, bristled when he realized that these moves had not been authorized. He ordered Colonel Jones to recall his men immediately, fearing that they might be caught in the punishing naval barrage that was still scheduled before the next planned phase of the offensive. It took nearly an hour of frantic signals and orders before the tanks and their infantry support reluctantly pulled back and order was restored along the designated line of departure. The second phase of the assault was scheduled for mid-afternoon. At 3:10 p.m., the cruiser Santa Fe began to pound Nat Circle with salvo after salvo of 5-inch shells. The Marines braced themselves for the push that would sweep the rest of Roi clear. 5 minutes later, the supporting half-track guns joined in, sending 75mm shells into the battered defenses. At 3:30, the infantry surged forward. The defenders, who had survived the bombardment, returned fire with 20mm cannons and rifles, but it was scattered and weak. Most of their comrades were already dead or dying in shattered bunkers. Captain John Padley's Company F swept through the ruined hangars near the northern airstrip, where twisted steel and smoking wreckage testified to the destruction. Beside them, Captain Karl Gressendorf's Company E kept pace, advancing cautiously but meeting little organized resistance. On their right, Captain Neiman's Sherman tanks lumbered forward again, their 75mm guns shattering the pillboxes that still spat defiant bursts of fire. In the confusion of the advance, 4 Marines from Gressendorf's unit tumbled into a shell crater. Believing there was a Japanese position nearby, Private First Class Richard Anderson pulled the pin from his grenade, but the weapon slipped from his grasp and rolled to the bottom of the hole. In the split second of realization, Anderson threw himself over the live grenade, absorbing the explosion with his body and saving his comrades. He would later be awarded the Medal of Honor for this sacrifice. On the western side of Roi, Hammond's 1st Battalion remained in place until ordered forward in the late afternoon. When Captain Fred Eberhardt's Company C finally advanced, they did so in force. Light tanks rumbled ahead of them, guns blazing, while half-tracks followed with more heavy firepower. The Marines charged quickly up the shoreline, cutting down, scattered defenders, and passing through landscapes littered with wreckage and mangled corpses left by days of bombardment. The resistance they met was piecemeal at best, consisting of a handful of Japanese soldiers firing desperate bursts from trenches or craters before being wiped out. By 4 p.m., Eberhardt's men had reached Norbert Circle at the northwestern tip, sealing off the last corners of the island. Only Nat Circle still held out, and even there the defenders were faltering. Colonel Dillon ordered Captain Frank Snapp's Company G, which had been in reserve, to eliminate the final stronghold. Supported by half-track guns that hammered the pillboxes, steel doors, a demolition team crept forward under fire. Spotting a crack in the roof, a Marine shoved a Bangalore torpedo into the gap, while others placed explosives at the firing slits. A massive blast tore through the structure. When the smoke cleared, Marines rushed inside to find 3 machine guns silenced and their crews dead. Observers noted that the firing ports faced only north, east, and west, revealing that the Japanese had expected the assault from the sea, not the lagoon. This flaw in their defense had given the attackers a crucial advantage. By 4:45 p.m., all serious resistance on Roi had collapsed. A few hours later, Colonel Jones declared the island secure. The battle had gone far more smoothly than anticipated, a rare stroke of fortune in the Pacific campaign. Across the lagoon, however, the story was entirely different. The 24th Marines prepared to storm Namur in chaotic conditions. Waves of landing craft and amphibious tanks approached through smoke and spray, their formation already disordered. Nearly 36 amphibious tanks from the 1st Armored Amphibian Battalion were meant to lead the way, smashing through defenses and pushing inland to cover the infantry. Yet inexplicably they stopped short, only 50 yards from shore, leaving the Marines in their wake to push ahead without armored cover. In the confusion, the smaller amphibious tractors surged past the hesitant tanks, drawing fire as they clawed their way onto the beaches. Second Lieutenant John Chapin, commanding a platoon in Company K, peered out from his vehicle as it nosed toward Green Beach 1. Through the haze, he could barely make out the shoreline. He turned to speak with his platoon sergeant, only to find him slumped lifeless, a bullet having torn through his skull. Moments later, his platoon guide had his hand blown apart by a sniper's round, screaming for a sailor in desperate hope that a corpsman might help him. Chapin, now having lost 2 of his closest subordinates within minutes of landing, feared that Namur was about to turn into another blood-soaked nightmare like Tarawa. On Green Beach 2, to the right of Chapin's sector, 2 assault companies also struggled ashore. Their advance was chaotic as well, but opposition there was weak. Occasionally, a Japanese soldier would dart from cover, fire a few shots, and be cut down in a storm of grenades and rifle fire. On the extreme right flank, however, Marines of Company F ran into determined resistance from a pillbox at Sally Point. Machine gun fire lashed the beach until supporting weapons from the 25th Marines on a nearby islet blasted the position into ruins. With both beaches secured, the assault teams began pressing inland, but the nature of Namur made progress slow and perilous. Unlike Roi, which was flat and open around its airstrip, Namur was cloaked in thick vegetation. The bombardment had left it a tangled wasteland of splintered palms, crushed buildings, and wreckage that concealed pillboxes and strongpoints. The Marines had to move cautiously, sometimes flushing out lone Japanese who stumbled from hiding in suicidal attacks, sometimes calling in engineers to blast apart reinforced shelters. Within minutes, forward teams had penetrated 200 yards into the island, but the jungle of debris made control almost impossible. Units became intermingled, losing contact with one another. Companies drifted into the wrong sectors, creating dangerous gaps. Reinforcements were rushed forward to patch the line, but they too became bogged down by rifle fire and scattered machine guns. The fighting devolved into a series of small, brutal clashes amid the wreckage. In the 3rd Battalion's zone, Chapin's group linked up with Lieutenant John Power's men in front of a massive bunker built of oil drums packed with sand. Every attempt to skirt the position was swept aside by ferocious gunfire. The 2 young officers crouched behind a wall to plan their assault. With covering fire blasting overhead, Chapin led a Marine forward with a Bangalore torpedo while Power attacked from the rear with riflemen. Grenades went off, the torpedo was shoved into place, and the structure shook under the explosion. But it was not finished. Power, bleeding from a wound to the stomach, pressed on. Carrying a shaped charge, he and another Marine raced to the rear door and set off another devastating blast. When the smoke cleared, the bunker was silent. Power staggered back, his uniform soaked in blood, but refused to leave his men. Moments later, at another pillbox, he led yet another attack. Clutching his wounded belly, he shoved his carbine into the opening and fired a full magazine before being cut down by bullets to the stomach and throat. His courage inspired those around him, who overran the position in rage. Power's sacrifice would earn him the Medal of Honor, but for the men of Namur the cost was mounting. Elsewhere, Captain Koken's company landed in early afternoon and began clearing beach obstacles. 3 light tanks rolled in behind them but quickly bogged down in churned sand and shell craters, leaving the infantry to continue alone. The Japanese defenders were scattered and uncoordinated, but every bunker or trench demanded blood to capture. Small groups of Marines fought through the debris with grenades, satchel charges, and flamethrowers, inching forward through the dense wreckage as Namur turned into a brutal contest of attrition. As the tank crews jumped out to free their stalled machines, almost 30 Japanese soldiers suddenly burst out of bunkers that had seemed deserted and rushed them. The Marines reacted instantly, cutting them down with rifles and pistols, taking 2 prisoners but losing one of their own in the melee. At the same time, Lieutenant Colonel Brunelli's battalion kept advancing across the western half of the island, one side hugging the shoreline while the rest pressed inland toward a designated phase line called Sycamore Boulevard, a road running east to west, nearly 2/3 of the way across Namur. But like much of the terrain, Sycamore was buried under wreckage and rubble, making it nearly impossible for the officers on the ground to be sure of its position. To the east, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Brink's 2nd Battalion, already scattered and disorganized, was pinned down by relentless bursts of machine gun fire pouring out of a strong blockhouse guarding Nut Lane near Nadine Point. Just a short distance away, other Marines came to a halt when they spotted a massive bunker. It showed no sign of activity, but ignoring it might have exposed them to crossfire or sudden counterattacks if defenders were hiding inside. Commanders decided it had to be dealt with, and demolition specialists were summoned. Lieutenant Saul Stein led a team from Company F to approach from the left, while Lieutenant Joseph Litt's men from Company E crept in from the right. Moving cautiously, the engineers planted a shaped charge against the thick wall and then scrambled back. When it blew, the explosion tore open the concrete and sent more than 20 Japanese bolting for cover, clearly shocked they had survived. The hole gaped wide, and the teams rushed in again, tossing satchel charges through the breach. What followed defied imagination. A massive detonation ripped through the area, launching flame, smoke, and tons of debris high into the sky as though the ground itself had erupted. The concussion flattened men, splintered trees, and even stopped approaching landing craft in their tracks. One Marine was blasted into the lagoon and, against all odds, later pulled out alive by sailors. The blast was so immense that an observer, circling overhead, radioed in disbelief that the whole island seemed to have vanished. On Roi, across the channel, every Marine instinctively snapped their heads to witness the towering cloud rising thousands of feet. Many assumed the entire garrison on Namur had been obliterated. Some even thought the Navy had resumed bombardment or accidentally dropped a heavy bomb. Only later did it become clear that the bunker had been used to stockpile more than 100. Torpedo warheads all set off at once by the satchels. A massive brown cloud rolled outward, enveloping the Marines in choking fumes. Many gasped for air, convinced they were under chemical attack, and frantically searched for the gas masks they had discarded earlier in the landing. Then the sky itself seemed to fall. Great chunks of reinforced concrete, shattered timber, and tree trunks rained down like meteors, crushing or wounding anyone they struck. Some torpedo warheads were hurled into the air and exploded as they crashed back to Earth, while at least 2 more deafening secondary blasts tore through nearby bunkers. For a time, everything descended into bedlam. In the chaos, 20 Marines were killed and 100 wounded. Company F took the heaviest blow. 14 of its men, including Lieutenant Stein, were dead and more than 40 injured. Brink himself was wounded but refused to be evacuated, pulling in fresh reserves from Company A to steady his shaken battalion. The carnage crushed morale and slowed the attack, while the Japanese defenders, sensing opportunity, suddenly revived. The sharp stutter of Nambu machine guns and rifle fire cut across the battlefield, and what had earlier been a steady push against scattered resistance dissolved into a slow, grinding advance. By early afternoon, most Marines had reached the general line of Sycamore Boulevard, but crossing it was nearly impossible. 3 blockhouses had been positioned to dominate the area, one near Nub Lane in the center, another at the end of Nut Lane toward Nadine Point, and a third at an intersection called Junction 58. Each spat fire at any attempt to move forward, forcing the momentum to stall. With his headquarters finally established ashore, Colonel Hart recognized that the Japanese had fully recovered from the pre-invasion bombardment. He ordered his men to dig in temporarily, reorganize, and prepare for another push. By late afternoon, replacements were filtering in, Company A took over on the right where 2nd Battalion had been mauled, while Company C moved up to relieve the battered Company E. Company L, delayed by boat shortages, finally arrived and was directed to relieve other elements so fresh units could reposition along the front. A careful new line was pieced together, stretching from Company the Fawn on the far left by the western shore across to Company G and Company F, reinforced by Company A near Nadine Point. Tanks and amphibious tractors rolled up and fired into the stubborn blockhouses. Their shells shattered 2 of them, but bounced harmlessly off the thick walls of the Nut Lane strongpoint, which would hold out the rest of the day. At exactly 4:30, Brunelli's 3rd Battalion lunged forward into a storm of gunfire. The defenders were scattered but fought with desperation, firing machine guns and sniping from hidden bunkers while mortars rained down. Every yard had to be fought over. In one sector, Corporal Alex Halahik's squad was pinned flat by fire. Already wounded twice, Halahik ordered his men to stay put, crawled forward alone, and wiped out the gun crew with his rifle, earning the Navy Cross for saving his squad. On the right, delays from reorganizing kept 2nd Battalion from jumping off on time. But when they finally pushed forward with tank support, they too found themselves struggling in terrain clogged with ruined buildings and blasted trees. Tanks surged ahead, blasting with machine guns and canister rounds, but soon lost contact with the infantry as they pushed nearly 300 yards past the start line. Captain James Denig's tank detoured down a side road, became separated, and stalled in a clearing. At that instant, 5 Japanese burst from cover and clambered onto it. One dropped a grenade through an open port, wounding the crew and igniting flames. Private First Class Howard Smith of Company A appeared in time, raked the attackers with his automatic rifle, and cut down 4, while another Marine shot the 5th as he scrambled over the burning hull. Smith dragged Danig out, mortally wounded, and managed to pull 2 more men to safety before the flames consumed the driver. His valor earned him the Navy Cross. Meanwhile, Captain Garrison's company, badly bloodied from the earlier blast, clawed through to Narcissus Street near the northern shore. Lacking support, they were pulled back to consolidate a defensive bulge. On the far right, along the coast near Nadine Point, small groups kept pushing forward under constant fire. At the very front was Corporal Arthur Irvin, a grizzled former raider known for chewing tobacco even in combat. Charging recklessly ahead of the scouts, he hurled grenades and fired shot after shot at any Japanese who appeared, driving the attack forward with raw determination. As the unit reached the heavily fortified stronghold at Nut Lane, it was Irvin who charged first, setting the pace for the others. Lieutenant Roy Wood's men tried to keep up, but the storm of enemy bullets quickly pinned them down. Machine. Gunners George Smith and the young Steve Hopkins, barely 18 and son of presidential advisor Harry Hopkins, scrambled with Lieutenant Phil Wood into a trench where they set up their Browning. Smith immediately opened fire, rattling the defenders, while Wood and Hopkins crept deeper down the trench. On the way, a body that seemed lifeless suddenly jerked upright, clutching a grenade. Hopkins, startled, fired his weapon point blank, but the soldier didn't fall. Only after Hopkins emptied his clip into the man did he collapse, leaving Hopkins shaken and wide-eyed. Just then, enemy mortars began raining down. Irvin, reckless as ever, leapt from cover and dashed forward on his own, cutting down 2 gunners, before returning with his assessment of the blockhouse's defenses. Phil Wood planned to bring mortars to bear, but before that could happen, bazooka teams struck the bunker and Marines surged forward. Irvin and Lieutenant Harry Reynolds hurled grenades into firing slits, but gunfire from a nearby dugout tore into Irvin's stomach. Reynolds, Roy Wood, and others countered with grenades and rifle bursts as Sergeant Frank Tucker and Corporal Franklin Robbins stormed in. Tucker shot the guard at the entrance while both men rushed inside, filling the dugout with gunfire until every defender was dead. The main blockhouse opened fire again, and Marines attempting to outflank it were caught in a deadly crossfire near the beach. A dozen men were pinned until Reynolds and Wood rallied them. Platoon Sergeant James Adams charged a machine gun nest, silencing it before falling dead in the attempt. Corporal Robbins fought with desperate fury, holding off a counterattack before being struck down himself. Reynolds fought from behind a log until a shot ripped through his leg, while Tucker, exposed behind a shattered tree, kept firing despite bullets slashing his helmet and smashing his canteen. Other Marines hurled grenades to him, which he tossed, back into enemy trenches, thinning their numbers. When the last grenades were spent, Tucker called for covering fire so he could slip away. Private Lawrence Knight and Lester Kincaid laid down suppressive bursts, though Knight was hit in the cheek. Furious, he returned fire until ordered to the rear. The Marines, emboldened, closed in and overran the enemy, leaving dozens of bodies behind as night fell. Instead of pushing forward, Colonel Hart ordered his men to entrench for the night. Veterans who had faced Japanese infiltration feared what would come, but they obeyed orders and dug in as darkness spread across the battlefield. Flares burst overhead, lighting a wasteland of bodies, ruined bunkers, and shattered trees. Sporadic rifle fire cracked in every direction, confirming that the enemy was closing in. Marines fired into the night, tracers streaking across the darkness, while infiltrators tried crawling into foxholes. Many were killed at the perimeter, but the defenders also suffered. Hopkins, the young Marine who had earlier saved his officer, was mortally wounded while guarding a flank. Before dawn, rustling grew louder in front of the 3rd Battalion. Suddenly, with cries of "Banzai!" enemy soldiers stormed out of the brush in waves, charging with bayonets, rifles, and swords. The Marines unleashed everything: rifles, grenades, machine guns, but the attackers broke through a gap and the fight turned into a brutal melee of knives, rifles used as clubs, and hand-to-hand struggle. Only the arrival of reinforcements from Company L and tanks turned the tide. During the chaos, 6 Marines in a shell hole watched a grenade land among them. Without hesitation, Private Richard Sorensen threw himself on it, taking the full blast. Severely wounded but alive, he was dragged to safety by Corpsman James Kirby, who had been treating scores of wounded nearby. Sorensen's sacrifice saved his comrades and later earned him the Medal of Honor. In little more than half an hour, the attack had been crushed, leaving more than 100 enemy dead before Company B's position. The cost was high. Their 3rd platoon nearly destroyed. To prepare for more assaults, Company K was recalled to reinforce the line. Meanwhile, General Schmidt, who had landed the night before, took charge of the operation. He ordered tanks and fresh troops to cross from Roi to Namur. With resupplied armor, the Marines launched a coordinated attack at 9 a.m. Company K advanced along the western shore, flanked by Companies WAM and L with tank support, while the battered Company B was held in reserve. On the opposite flank, Lieutenant Colonel Aquila Das took over after Colonel Brink was evacuated, pushing his companies eastward with tanks in support. The Nut Lane blockhouse continued to resist until concentrated fire from tanks and half-tracks finally crushed it. From then on, progress quickened. This LED from the front, urging men forward and sweeping the underbrush until his Marines reached the northern beaches. There, a last group of defenders had taken position in an anti-tank ditch. Light tanks scoured the trench with canister rounds, and Das, sprinting to the front, pointed out the final attack before being cut down by machine gun fire. His bravery earned him a posthumous Medal of Honor. By early afternoon, the surviving defenders were wiped out, and by 2 o'clock, the islands were secured. The battlefield was a nightmare of corpses stacked in trenches, shredded trees, and blasted structures. Out of more than 3,500 defenders, only a handful survived to surrender, most of them Korean laborers. The Marines had suffered hundreds of casualties, nearly 200 killed. Many acts of heroism went unrecorded, but the official awards of Medals of Honor and Navy Crosses reflected the extraordinary courage shown. The victory at Roi and Namur marked the Marines' first major action of the campaign. The lessons from earlier battles had been applied, and the operation set the standard for future amphibious assaults. With the marshals secured, American forces prepared for the next step toward Japan itself. For the 4th Marine Division, Roi Namur was their baptism of fire, and from that day forward they carried the memory into every grim battle that followed. Saipan, Tinian, and finally Iwo Jima, where the struggle would be even more unrelenting. But it was here at Roi Namur that they first proved themselves, charging forward without hesitation and never turning back.